Picture this, April 10th, 2024, Brussels, Belgium. The world's most powerful finance ministers from G7 countries are locked in a private meeting. They wrestling with one critical question: what should we do with Russia's massive pile of frozen money? Ever since February 2022, Western nations have been holding on to $300 billion of Russian central bank funds. Notice I said frozen, not taken. Just frozen solid. This cash is sitting untouched in accounts at Belgium's Euroclear, the New York Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England. Russia can't touch this money, but here's the thing: the West hasn't actually seized it either. For 2 whole years, this enormous amount of frozen wealth has been sitting there like a bargaining chip, the unspoken deal. Walk away from Ukraine, and you'll get your money back. Fast forward to April 2024, the war has dragged into its 3rd year. Ukraine's running dangerously low on funds. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress is completely stuck. They can't agree on sending more aid. Something's gotta break. Inside that conference room, history is about to be made. The G7 reaches a groundbreaking decision. They'll take the interest payments. Here's how it works. That $300 billion pile generates around $3 billion every single year in interest. That interest money? It's getting sent straight to Ukraine. The official announcement drops on April 30th, 2024. News headlines everywhere are calling it justice. They're saying Russia's own frozen assets will help rebuild the country it invaded. Pretty clever, right? It's creative. It's like punishing someone without going all the way to full confiscation. But here's where things get really interesting. In central bank headquarters all around the globe, Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, Abu Dhabi, Brasilia, a completely different conversation is taking place. Finance ministers across these countries are pulling their teams aside and asking the exact same question. If Western powers can pull this off with Russia, what's stopping them from doing it to us? The answer? Absolutely nothing. If the West can lock up $300 billion because of political disagreements and then actually use that money to fund a war against the country that owns it, then every nation's reserves sitting in dollars, euros, or pounds are at risk. Your sovereign money is only truly yours until someone decides it isn't anymore. This realization changes everything. So what happens next? Quietly, without any big announcements or press conferences, central banks worldwide start doing something they haven't done on this scale in half a century. They start dumping U.S. Treasury bonds, not in a panic, not all at once, but steadily, methodically, month after month after month. By December 2024, just 8 months after that, G7 decision, foreign ownership of U.S. Treasuries has dropped by a staggering $400 billion. China offloaded $89 billion. Japan dumped $95 billion. Saudi Arabia sold $32 billion. This isn't your typical profit-taking behavior. This is a coordinated, worldwide strategic retreat from U.S. Treasury bonds, and it was triggered directly by the choice to grab Russia's interest payments. And folks, this is just the beginning. Let me walk you through the complete story of how we arrived at this moment, the exact mechanism that turned seizing Russia's $300 billion into a global exodus from treasuries. I'll show you the real-time data proving this is happening right now, which specific countries are selling, and what they're purchasing as replacements, who's stepping up to buy what they're selling, and what happens when the answer becomes the Federal Reserve, which is basically the technical definition of a treasury market collapse. Because here's the truth, this story isn't really about Russia. Sure, Russia lost $300 billion, but the real catastrophe? That's happening to the United States. By turning the treasury market into a weapon, the U.S. just destroyed the very thing that made American power possible in the first place. The ability to borrow unlimited money at rock-bottom interest rates because the entire world trusted U.S. debt above everything else. That trust? It's gone. And once you lose trust, you don't get it back. Let's rewind to before February 22. The U.S. Treasury market was the deepest, most liquid, most reliable financial market on planet Earth. Total U.S. government debt held publicly, $24 trillion. Foreign nations held roughly $7.6 trillion of that, about 30% of the total. China was sitting on $1.1 trillion. Japan held $1.3 trillion. This was business as usual. This had been rock-solid stable for literally decades. Foreign countries would pile up dollars through trade surpluses and needed a safe place to park them. U.S. Treasuries were the no-brainer choice, secure, easy to buy and sell, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But it was more than just safety. Treasuries were seen as being above politics. Sure, the U.S. had frozen assets of enemy nations in the past: Cuba, Iran after the 1979 revolution, North Korea, Libya, Venezuela. But these were tiny countries, rogue regimes, acknowledged enemies. The unwritten rules were crystal clear. If you're a regular country with normal diplomatic relations, your treasury holdings are completely safe. This unspoken guarantee was the entire foundation of dollar dominance. The U.S. could run infinite budget deficits because the world would always buy the debt. This was what experts call the exorbitant privilege. Then February 24, 2022 happens. Russia invades Ukraine. Within just 72 hours, Western nations announced that Russian central bank reserves will be frozen solid. The total? $300 billion. $100 billion sitting in Euroclear. $100 billion at the New York Fed. $50 billion at the Bank of England. Another $50 billion spread across other European central banks. This was absolutely unprecedented, not because asset freezes were new, but because Russia wasn't North Korea. Russia was the world's 11th largest economy. Russia was a massive energy exporter. Russia held a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And Russia had $600 billion in total reserves, with $300 billion deliberately held in Western currencies as insurance against exactly this kind of sanctions. Russia had diversified into Western reserves thinking they were untouchable. They were dead wrong. Every other central bank on earth took notice immediately. The public reaction was quiet, but behind closed doors, absolute chaos. Central bank governors called emergency meetings. The question on everyone's mind was brutally simple. How much of our reserves could be seized? For China, the answer was absolutely terrifying. China held $3.4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. Roughly $1.1 trillion was in U.S. Treasuries, another $500 billion in other dollar-based assets. Over $1.5 trillion potentially at risk if relations with the U.S. went south. Saudi Arabia, $120 billion in treasuries at risk. UAE, $40 billion. Taiwan, $240 billion. South Korea, $170 billion. Every single country holding substantial dollar reserves suddenly realized those reserves were essentially hostages to U.S. foreign policy. If the U.S. could freeze Russia's $300 billion for invading Ukraine, America could freeze anyone's reserves for any reason Washington considered justified enough. The reserves weren't safe deposits, they were leverage points. But the freeze by itself wasn't quite enough to trigger mass panic selling. Central banks moved cautiously. They were hoping the freeze was temporary, specifically tied to the Ukraine war, and that once the war wrapped up, normal rules would kick back in. That hope was completely shattered on April 30, 2024. The G7 announcement that Russia's frozen assets would actually be used, that the interest would be handed over to Ukraine, crossed a massive line. This wasn't just freezing assets pending some resolution. This was actively confiscating assets and handing them directly to Russia's enemy in the war. The legal justification was creative, I'll give them that. The interest isn't the principal amount. Russia technically still owns the $300 billion. We're just taking the profits it generates. But from a central bank's perspective, this distinction was completely meaningless. If you own an asset and someone else is taking all the income it produces, do you really own it functionally? No. This was the unmistakable signal that Treasury holdings could be confiscated for political reasons. And the selling kicked into high gear. The data is publicly available. The U.S. Treasury releases it every month. Here's exactly what happened after April 2024, between April and December 2024. Foreign holdings crashed by $400 billion in just 8 months. China dumped $89 billion. Japan sold off $95 billion. Saudi Arabia unloaded $32 billion. Belgium, which manages money for Middle Eastern nations, sold $25 billion. The Cayman Islands, basically a proxy for Chinese institutional money, sold $18 billion. This is the biggest sustained foreign selling spree in U.S. history outside of an actual financial crisis. And this is just the opening act because central banks don't move everything at once. They sell gradually to avoid crashing the market and destroying the value of what they still hold. The selling we've witnessed so far is the careful first wave. The real tsunami is still coming. When foreign central banks were the steady buyers of treasuries, the U.S. could borrow infinite amounts at cheap rates. Treasury would issue bonds. Foreign central banks would buy them. This kept interest rates low, even as the debt mountain kept growing. But when foreign central banks stop buying and start selling instead, somebody else has to step up and buy. There are exactly four possible buyers: domestic institutions, regular American households, foreign private investors, and the Federal Reserve. Domestic institutions like pension funds already own $6 trillion in treasuries. They can't dramatically increase that without becoming dangerously overexposed. American households hold $3 trillion and they're not increasing their holdings. Foreign private investors face the exact same freezing concerns as central banks do. That leaves the Federal Reserve. The Fed is supposed to operate independently from the Treasury Department. But when nobody else will buy, the Fed has no choice but to step in, otherwise yields spike through the roof and we get a fiscal crisis. This is what economists call debt monetization. The central bank printing fresh money to purchase government bonds. It's what Zimbabwe did, what Weimar Germany did, what Venezuela did. It always ends in either runaway inflation or a complete currency collapse, and it's already happening right now. At the start of 2024, the Fed held $5 trillion in treasuries. By December 2024, $5.2 trillion. The Fed is buying again, even though they publicly claim they're shrinking their balance sheet. Why? Because somebody has to buy. Foreign central banks are dumping $400 billion. Domestic buyers aren't stepping up. The Fed absorbs the selling. The Fed's share of the entire Treasury market jumped from 20% in early 2024 to 22% by year-end. That's a 10% increase in Fed ownership in just 8 months. This is the debt monetization death spiral beginning to unfold. Let me show you the specific countries that are selling and their reasons. China slashed Treasury holdings from $1.1 trillion in March 2024 down to $980 billion by December. That's $120 billion sold in 8 months. China is selling for two major reasons. First, China watched what happened to Russia and knows they could be next if they make a move on Taiwan. Second, China is actively preparing for a world beyond dollar dominance, building the CIPS payment system, negotiating oil purchases in yuan, lending to Belt and Road countries in yuan. Japan cut holdings from $1.20 trillion down to $1.1 trillion, a $100 billion drop. Japan is a close U.S. ally and isn't worried about getting frozen out, but Japan has its own massive fiscal crisis to deal with. Japan needs to finance its own catastrophic 260% debt-to-GDP ratio, so they're selling treasuries to fund their own borrowing needs. This is hugely significant because Japan has been the most dependable treasury buyer for the past 30 years. Saudi Arabia slashed holdings from $135 billion in 2023 down to $90 billion by the end of 2024. That's a 33% reduction in just 18 months. Saudi Arabia is technically a U.S. ally, but they watched Russia's reserves get frozen and asked themselves, could America freeze ours too? The answer is absolutely yes. If Saudi Arabia cut oil production against U.S. wishes, or if they aligned too closely with China, the U.S. could freeze their reserves. Saudi is diversifying aggressively, buying massive amounts of gold, accepting yuan for oil payments, joined BRICS in January 2024, the UAE, Kuwait, and other Gulf states are following Saudi Arabia's playbook. Combined, Gulf countries reduced treasury holdings by $80 billion throughout 2024. The selling is global in scope. It's coordinated not through some secret conspiracy, but through shared fear. Every central bank witnessed what happened to Russia and reached the same conclusion: reduce Treasury exposure immediately. So what are they buying instead? Gold. Central bank gold purchases in 2024 topped 1,100 tons for the third straight year, the highest sustained buying wave since the 1970s, right before the gold standard completely collapsed. China officially purchased 225 tons in 2024, but likely bought 400-plus tons unofficially. Turkey grabbed 80 tons. India bought 75 tons. Poland added 60 tons. Why gold? Because gold cannot be frozen. Gold sitting in your own vaults belongs to you, period. Russia's gold reserves inside Russia were never frozen. Only their Western reserves were vulnerable. Every central bank learned the same lesson: hold gold domestically. They're also buying other currencies. The yuan's share of global reserves jumped from 2.3% in 2022 to 3.2% by 2024. That's 40% growth in just 2 years. Still tiny compared to the dollar's 58% share, but the trend is unmistakable. Some central banks are even buying strategic commodities directly: oil, copper, rare earth elements. Real assets with intrinsic value that can't be digitally frozen with the click of a mouse. The pattern is crystal clear: diversification away from treasuries across the board. And the more they diversify away, the fewer buyers exist for new treasury issuance. Here's the mathematical nightmare this creates. The U.S. government runs deficits of $2 trillion every single year. Total borrowing needs? $7 trillion annually, $2 trillion in net new borrowing, plus $5 trillion refinancing maturing debt. Before 2022, foreign buyers purchased 30% of new issuance, roughly $600 billion annually. Domestic buyers grabbed 50%, about $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve bought 20%, around $400 billion. Now, in the post-April 2024 world, foreign buyers are selling $400 billion per year instead of buying $600 billion. That's a $1 trillion swing in demand. Domestic buyers haven't increased their purchases, so the Fed has to cover the entire gap. The Fed's purchases exploded from $400 billion up to $1.4 trillion annually to absorb both new issuance and foreign selling. This means the Fed is now purchasing roughly 70% of net new Treasury issuance when you account for foreign selling. The Fed is the market now. And when the central bank becomes the market has fundamentally failed. This creates a vicious death spiral. The Fed buying treasuries means printing money. Printing money triggers inflation. Inflation destroys the real value of treasuries, making foreign holders want to sell even more, which forces the Fed to buy even more, which prints even more money, which causes even more inflation, which triggers even more selling. This is precisely how a currency loses reserve status. Let me map out the timeline for you. 2022 February, Russia's $300 billion gets frozen. The first seed of doubt gets planted in every central bank's mind. 2022 to 2023, cautious diversification begins quietly. China and Saudi Arabia start slowly trimming treasury holdings. 2024 April, G7 announces they'll actually use Russian assets. Doubt transforms into certainty. Selling accelerates dramatically. 2024-2025, foreign selling intensifies sharply. $800 billion to $1 trillion annual outflow expected. Fed buying increases to compensate. 2026 to 2028, the breaking point approaches. Foreign holdings fall below $6 trillion. Fed holdings exceed $7 trillion, that's 30% of all treasuries. Markets start pricing in serious inflation risk. 10-year yields climb from 4% up to 6 to 7%, despite aggressive Fed buying. 2029 to 2032, the crisis becomes undeniable. Treasury auctions start actually failing. Yields spike to 8 to 10% as interest payments on $40 trillion in debt exceed $3 trillion annually, consuming 60% of total tax revenue. The Fed is forced to dramatically ramp up buying. 2033 to 2037, full currency crisis. The dollar loses reserve status for commodity transactions. Dollar's share of global reserves crashes to 40%. Inflation accelerates to 7 to 10% annually. 2037 to 2042. The dollar is no longer the dominant reserve currency. Still the largest single currency, but not hegemonic anymore. The U.S. must balance its budget or face hyperinflation. This timeline assumes a gradual, managed decline. It could accelerate dramatically with a trigger event: Taiwan invasion, major bank failure, political crisis. But even without any external shocks, the mathematical endpoint remains the same. When the central bank becomes the primary buyer of government debt, the currency is doomed. Period. So who wins and who loses in this new world? China wins strategically. China is dumping treasuries, stockpiling gold and commodities, building the CIPS alternative payment system. When the dollar loses reserve status, the yuan rises by default. China is actively preparing for a post-dollar world while the U.S. desperately clings to dollar dominance. Gold holders win big. As central banks buy massive amounts of gold to replace treasuries, prices skyrocket. Gold is currently hovering around $4,300 per ounce. If central banks continue buying 1,000 tons annually for the next decade, gold hits $7,000, $8,000 by 2035. That's a 200% return. The United States loses its hegemony. The ability to borrow unlimited amounts at low interest rates funds everything: the military, Social Security, Medicare. It allows Americans to consume way more than they produce. When the Treasury market fails and borrowing becomes expensive, all of this becomes completely unaffordable. The $880 billion military budget works at 3% borrowing costs. It becomes unsustainable at 8% rates. American consumers lose purchasing power dramatically. Americans import $3.8 trillion worth of goods and export $3 trillion, an $800 billion deficit. This only works when the world willingly accepts dollars. When the dollar loses value, imports become crushingly expensive. Gas, electronics, clothing, everything rises 30 to 50% over the next decade. U.S. Treasury bondholders lose massive wealth. If yields jump from 4% to 8%, existing bonds lose 30 to 40% of their value instantly. Domestic institutions hold $9 trillion in treasuries. That represents $3 trillion in potential losses. Retirees lose their security. As the dollar loses purchasing power, Social Security and Medicare benefits decline in real terms. A $2,000 monthly check today might only buy $100 buys in 2035. This is the distributed cost of reserve currency collapse. Not one single dramatic crash, but slow, grinding erosion over 10 to 15 years. Why is this irreversible? The Treasury market is fundamentally built on trust. For 80 years straight, the world trusted that U.S. Treasuries were bulletproof safe regardless of politics. That trust allowed the U.S. to borrow at privileged rates that no other country could access. But trust, once you break it, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Russia's reserves got frozen. The interest got confiscated. Every central bank on earth witnessed this. They can't unsee what happened. Central banks now know that U.S. law explicitly allows the president to freeze foreign assets under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The president just has to declare an emergency, any emergency. Ukraine was declared an emergency. Taiwan would be an emergency. Literally anything can be framed as an emergency. So no central bank can genuinely trust their reserves are safe anymore. Without trust, they must diversify. There's no other rational choice. The U.S. could theoretically restore trust by stripping the president of asset freezing authority entirely. But that's never going to happen. Asset freezing is far too useful as a geopolitical tool. The U.S. could potentially hold assets through a neutral third party like the Bank for International Settlements. But that would mean surrendering control, which America won't do. There's simply no way to restore trust without giving up the weapon. And the U.S. will never surrender this weapon voluntarily. But here's the cruel irony. The weapon itself is killing the very thing that gave the U.S. its power, the Treasury market. Want a historical parallel? In 1914, Britain weaponized finance by seizing German assets during World War I. Neutral countries witnessed that Britain would seize assets for political reasons. They diversified away from pounds. After WWI ended, New York began steadily replacing London as the financial center. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar formally replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's financial dominance lasted about 30 years after the 1914 weaponization. The U.S. froze Russia's reserves in 2022. If the historical pattern holds, the dollar loses reserve status by 2052. But modern technology accelerates everything dramatically. Central banks can shift reserves in hours instead of months now. China's SIP's payment volume went from $12 trillion in 2020 to $27 trillion in 2023, doubling in just 3 years. My estimate: the dollar loses reserve dominance by 2037-2042, roughly 15 to 20 years from the 2022 freeze. The dollar's share of reserves falls from 58% today down to 35 to 40% by 2040. Still, the largest single currency, but no longer hegemonic. And the catalyst for all of this was seizing Russia's $300 billion, specifically the April 2024 decision to actually use those assets. That was the precise moment trust shattered beyond repair. The United States faced a choice in February 2022: freeze Russia's reserves as leverage, or accept that financial warfare has hard limits. The U.S. chose to freeze. That decision was defensible as a wartime measure, but in April 2024, the U.S. made a completely different choice: actually use the frozen assets. Take the interest, transfer it to Ukraine. That crossed the line from freezing to outright confiscation. And that single decision destroyed the Treasury market. Because once you confiscate reserves, every country knows their reserves aren't truly safe. They can't trust you anymore. And once trust evaporates, the privileged position vanishes with it. The Treasury market is dying right now. Foreign central banks are selling $800 billion to $1 trillion per year. The Federal Reserve is buying frantically to compensate. The Fed's ownership share is rapidly approaching 30%. When the central bank owns 30% of government debt, you're approaching the textbook definition of a failed state. The timeline is 15 to 20 years out. By 2037 to 2042, the dollar will no longer be the dominant reserve currency. The Treasury market will no longer be the world's safe haven. The U.S. won't be able to borrow unlimited amounts anymore. The free lunch is over. And the trigger for all of this was seizing Russia's $300 billion. The U.S. gained $300 billion in frozen assets. But the U.S. lost the trust that supported $7.8 trillion in foreign Treasury holdings. That's a 26 to 1 loss ratio when you do the math. Russia lost $300 billion. America lost its entire financial empire. And the primary beneficiary? That's China, who watched carefully, learned the lessons, and prepared their alternative systems, while America systematically destroyed its own advantages. If this video showed you that the Treasury market is actively dying because of that April 2024 decision, if you now understand that foreign central banks are dumping treasuries right this moment, and the Federal Reserve is becoming the buyer of last resort, if you see this as the beginning of dollar reserve status collapse unfolding over the next 15 to 20 years, then subscribe. Because the next video reveals what happens when Treasury yields spike to 8 to 10% and the U.S. simply can't afford to service $40 trillion in debt anymore. There are 3 options on the table: default on Social Security and Medicare, hyperinflate the debt away, or restructure into regional currencies. All 3 options destroy the American middle class completely. The $300 billion they took from Russia will ultimately cost America $30 trillion in lost Treasury demand over the next 20 years. That's a 100 to 1 loss when you calculate it out. They broke the safe asset, they killed the Treasury market, and they did it to themselves.